It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. My team and I are taking a holiday season break today, and we're re-airing some segments from 2025 that we think you'll enjoy or enjoy again, lightly edited for clarity and time. So we can't take your calls today, but today we'll hear infectious disease epidemiologist Seth Berkley, who puts the anti-vax movement in historic context. Gen Z callers, nostalgic for pre-cellphone times, why Americans don't move so much anymore, Ilya Meritz on Trump versus academia and not just the Ivies. And speaking of, we start with the president of Princeton University, Christopher Eisgruber. He has a new book called Terms of Respect, How Colleges Get Free Speech Right. We'll see if he can convince you that they actually do as we pick it up here. It's an interesting title at a time when critics on both the left and the right, and free speech purists without a political side, all say colleges are getting it wrong. Christopher Eisgruber has been the Princeton president since 2013. He has the unusual, perhaps, academic track of having been a physics major at Princeton in the 80s, but going on to become a constitutional lawyer, including as a clerk for Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. He has written provocative books before, including one about undemocratic features of the U.S. Constitution, one that proposed reforming the Supreme Court Justice selection process, and one about the Constitution and religious liberty that argued that religion gets treated as both too privileged and too punished by modern applications of the wall of separation between religion and government as people see it. Maybe we'll touch on some of the themes of those older books as they relate to the new one about speech on campus. In a nutshell, Eisgruber argues that there can be a balance between free speech and respectful inclusivity. We'll see how he thinks we get there. I should also say President Eisgruber has been in the news this year for being outspoken early on about what he called the Trump administration's attack on Columbia University, presenting what he called the greatest threat to American universities since the Red Scare of the 1950s. A lot has happened since he wrote those words in The Atlantic in March, so we'll talk about that, as well as, of course, the new book, which again is called Terms of Respect, How Colleges Get Free Speech Right. President Eisgruber, thanks for coming on to discuss this vital topic. Welcome to WNYC.
Brian, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for that generous introduction.
You argue there's a gap between the perception and reality of campus free speech in general, driven by a few incidents that get a lot of press. So you could take a few minutes at the outset here, if you'd like, and lay out your thesis of what you think is happening on college campuses and why people might think it's worse than it is.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, my thesis in the book is that colleges and our country have a responsibility to support both free speech and equality at the same time. We need people to be able to speak up for their views, and we need everybody to feel like they are included and they've got a place at the table. It's true in our national political discussions. It's got to be true on college campuses. That's a demanding assignment for us as a country, and it's a demanding assignment for college campuses. But as you said, I think college campuses are doing that much better than people appreciate. There are some things that have gotten wrong. Been gotten wrong. There are terrible incidents that have taken place. You think about the shouting down of Judge Kyle Duncan at the Stanford Law School, for example, or the attacks on political scientists Charles Murray and Allison Stanger at Middlebury back in 2017. And those examples get a lot of attention. But there are millions of conversations that take place, speeches, classes, lectures, other kinds of exhibitions and discussions on college campuses successfully every day. Colleges respond when these incidents happen, and vital subjects get discussed in the way that they should be. I do say in the book that I think we as a country face a crisis right now that affects colleges along with everybody else. We are polarized to an extent that we have not been in the past. It makes it harder for people to talk to one another across differences and have the kinds of constructive discussions that matter, and social media makes that even harder. So colleges have a difficult assignment right now, but I think if one looks at the overall record, it's much better than people suppose and something we should be proud of.
Well, recently, after the killing of Charlie Kirk and the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel, we had Greg Lukianoff, president of the group FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I know you've addressed this group in particular in writing. You've taken some issue with their conclusions. Here's a clip of Lukianoff on the show talking about a 10-year arc of speech issues on campus as he sees it, and here's part of what he said.
The free speech crisis that I was seeing was primarily a combination of students and administrators getting together to punish their political enemies or speech that they didn't like. So, and this is one of the reasons why conservatives are so angry at the moment, is they feel like this crisis that had been going on campus for a long time was kind of poo-pooed. It was the media didn't pay a lot of attention to it, and now when it's actually the backlash happening to it, this is something that's getting a lot of coverage in mainstream media. So I get the frustration on the right.
So he thinks the media downplayed the anger of campus conservatives, poo-pooed it, he said there. You think, you argued in your first answer, that the media gave it too much exposure when incidents were high profile. But do you agree that many campus conservatives have felt they risked expressing their views? They risked backlash for expressing their views as students or faculty for fear of being denounced or even punished?
Look, I think we're in a set of circumstances today. We're on college campuses and off them. We are polarized into groups that not only disagree with one another, but dislike one another. There are opinion polls, one of them out of Johns Hopkins, for example, that says that 50% of Democrats and 50% of Republicans believe that people in the opposite party are downright evil. Downright evil is the term, so it's not just a disagreement, it's a real moral judgment. When you get circumstances like that, as I said earlier, tough to have discussions, hard for people to speak up because they are going to be criticized by the other side. So we have to worry about that on college campuses. And on this point, I agree with Greg Lukianoff. You can always find examples. You can find them from the left. You can find them from the right, where there are reactions that are impermissible, whether they're coming from college administrators or whether they're coming from politicians. It's wrong to shut down speech. And one of the things that I say very strongly in the book is that we need to have wide open discussions and we need to build cultures where people can be courageous. But yes, Brian, when it comes to what's the overall state of affairs, how are we coping in a more difficult free speech environment than we have seen in a long time? Again, I think that colleges are doing in general what they should be doing. I give some suggestions about how they can do that better, but they're doing what they should be doing to make that free speech possible.
And we'll get into a few of those suggestions that you make. We have one caller who's called in already. You know, I was just giving you some critiques from the right about the free speech environment on campus. I think this is going to come from a different point of view. Elena in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, Brian. Hi, President Eisgruber. Thanks for taking my call. My name is Elena. I'm a graduate student at Princeton, actually. And I'm very proud of all the ways that President Eisgruber has been standing up for free speech. At the same time, I can't help but to think of the fact that the encampments for Palestine 2 years ago were shut down within 5 minutes, which is actually one of the fastest of the Ivy League. So I am just curious for President Eisgruber, how does your defense of free speech relate to the university's stopping of peaceful speech about Palestine? To, you know, those of us who care about genocide, it seems as though the defense about free speech is actually only for certain types of speech or speech on certain issues. So I would love for you to kind of reconcile your defense of free speech with the quenching of student activism about Palestine. Thank you.
So, Elena, thank you for your question and thank you for calling in. Let me start with some general observations. When it comes to free speech under our Constitution or on college campuses, I think there are a couple of different propositions that are really important. One is that we have to have broad rights of free speech that allow people to speak up even when they're saying things that are offensive to their peers or to professors or to me or to other people. And in the United States and on our college campus, we have broader freedoms to do that than just about anywhere else. You can say lots of different things. And at Princeton and other college campuses, we emphatically affirm the right of people to be able to have these debates. But at the same time, you need time, place, and manner rules that allow people to go about their business on university campuses, that allow people to listen as well as to speak, and that create the right context for constructive discussions. So as a matter of constitutional law, you've got a lot of freedom to go down to Washington and criticize the government and criticize the individuals in the government. Doesn't mean that you can set up an encampment on the National Mall or spray paint the Washington Monument or occupy the lobby of the Commerce Department. And the same things have to be true on college campuses. So we were very clear as we went into the difficult spring of 2023-24 that people had the freedom to say things that on some campuses were actually being suppressed, and I think wrongly so. There were slogans that other presidents were saying you can't say that, or they were condemning the slogans. We avoided doing that because we have a very strong commitment to allowing people to say what it is that they want to say. We also have a commitment to allow people to protest, but there are limits to that commitment, time, place, and manner rules that apply without regard to what the speech is about. One of those prohibits putting up tents or other structures on campus. The other prohibits the occupation of buildings. And there are a number of other rules. All of those are essential to providing the fora in which people can actually interact and have the discussions that matter. So we allowed a lot of speech. But when people started to put up tents, we immediately put a stop to it.
Elena, I'm curious if that satisfies your concerns to any degree.
Yeah, it doesn't, Brian. And I appreciate the response, President Eisgruber. The reason it doesn't is because I think about two things. Number one, I think about the protests for Vietnam that were led at Columbia University that similarly set up encampments. Student activism the university has always been a safe ground for student activism. Right now at Princeton, at the beginning of every term, every semester, there are little placards on every dining table hall that say, here are the rights, rules, and regulations about protests. There are signs on university fields, greens, that say, by the way, you cannot protest here. And what that does is not only set limits on where we can protest, but creates a broader culture where people are actually quite afraid to speak their minds.
One more time on this, President Eisgruber, then we're going to move on.
Yeah, Elena, I appreciate your comments. What I would say is, you have to have those rules in order to enable people to both express themselves and be able to listen and be able to go about and do the other things that happen at universities. And I think it's really important that we be clear about what the rules are. So one of the initiatives that we've undertaken is to make sure that people understand, all right, here are the ways in which we've drawn these lines. There are places where you can protest. And as I said, you can protest in ways that some people are going to find offensive. And there are people writing to me saying, you got to shut that down. I hear that from people on the campus. I hear it from people off campus, including people in government. And our answer is people have to be able to protest and they have to be able to say what it is that they want to say. But we are going to draw those lines about time, place, and manner, how you can do it, where you can do it, when you can do it. And those are essential. And when we do that, we have to put out clear communications to folks so that people can make the judgment about whether they're going to cross those lines, in which case they're engaging in civil disobedience and will bear the consequences, or whether they want to protest in ways that are quite, I think, effective and voluble, but that are entirely within the limits. So we, I think, leave room for a vigorous culture of protest on the campus, but one with distinct limits to it.
My guest is the president of Princeton, Christopher Eisgruber, whose new book is Terms of Respect, How Colleges Get Free Speech Right. Let's keep exploring where that line is a little bit. You know, the review of your book in The New Yorker keyed on your line that it's possible to believe in free speech and insist that people ought to address each other civilly and politely. And it noted that Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes emphasized free speech includes, quote, opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unquote, from Oliver Wendell Holmes. Also about civility, New York Times columnist Roxane Gay had a column last week called Civility is a Fantasy, and it included this line, calling for civility is about exerting power. It is a way of reminding the powerless that they exist at the will of those in power and should act accordingly. It is a demand for control. And just one more further to this point, because we have a text that just came in that said, I am so tired of civility politics, time, place, and manager of the language of the oppressor. It feels like whites on the right win this argument. Those were two different texts that I put together. Your response on civility?
Well, so let me say first that civility and time, place, and manner are a little different from one another. So time, place, and manner, again, limits, for example, whether or not you can put up tents on a college green, or whether you can occupy a building, or the times when you might be able to use very loud speech that interferes with other activities. That by itself doesn't say anything about whether or not you have to be civil. And again, to repeat, we allow for protest on the Princeton campus, and I think colleges have to allow for protest that can include some distinctly uncivil speech, slogans that people find offensive and combative. That's consistent with the kind of free speech that I think needs to be able to occur on college campuses. But I do make an argument in terms of respect, and hence the title, that we all ought to be talking to one another in ways that are respectful, and that is really important to what goes on at colleges and universities. So protest gets a lot of attention on our campus, but what we are doing principally is scholarship and research and discussion that is trying to be rigorous and truth-seeking, and we need norms there where people can come in from different positions and different sides, hear one another, talk to one another, and learn from one another. So I saw that column by Roxane Gay, and I get it when she says we need to be able to take strong stands. And I think she talks about, look, it's not okay to say whatever you want to say just as long as you're polite, and that's the critical test. But I don't think that undermines the case for civility. The case for civility is a case that says, hey, we need fora at universities and elsewhere where people with really strong disagreements are able to come together and not only say what it is that they believe, or shout at the other side, or insult the other side, but actually have constructive arguments that are designed to persuade and designed to deepen our understanding. And that's part of what we try to create at Princeton University, and what other universities should try to be doing. You quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he has a lot of great things to say about the First Amendment and free speech. In the book, I prefer the work of Louis Brandeis, the great civil rights lawyer who was his contemporary, who talked about the need for courageous, self-reliant people to be using speech in ways that allow us to govern ourselves deliberatively, and his words, to develop our faculties. Those things depend on civility. So I think it's just wrong to believe that if you have strongly held convictions and values, you have to give up on civility.
One more on the bounds of civility and where that line should be. Aminata in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hello, Aminata.
Hi, I just have a quick question, in regards to the civility issue. I think I understand where you're coming from, but I wonder what your advice would be for people who are dealing with folks who don't believe they deserve human rights, right? Because a lot of the issues that I think we're finding and dealing with in terms of protests in relationships, to Gaza, but also, LGBTQ rights, all of these things that are happening, immigrants, you're dealing with folks who believe that these people do not have a right to exist here, should not be here, should be hunted down and killed, and I'm not being hyperbolic. So how are you civil with that? I think that it's a very hard line to draw when your personhood is being threatened not only with emotional violence but literally physical violence.
What's the? I'm going to invite you to take us one step further into that, because I'm sure you're not promoting violence. So what is it that's uncivil that you're saying should be more in the bucket of what President Eisgruber endorses?
I'm not saying it should be more. I'm saying that the idea that we should be I'm saying that the idea that we should be civil with people who are literally disagreeing with our ability to have human rights is a very difficult thing, and I think that that's a hard ask for a lot of people. That's what I'm saying. I think that needs to be recognized in your argument.
In terms of polite conversation is what you're getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I'll speak plainly. My mom isn't, I was born in this country. My mom is an immigrant. When Trump was talking about, we need to revert birthright citizenship, I was like immediately worried that ICE was going to come after her, even though she has her citizenship. Like, she got it when I was 8. Mm-hmm. But if I were to come into contact with someone who believes that she wasn't shouldn't be here and should be kidnapped by ICE and thrown into a detention center, I don't know that I would react civilly to that. I'm not saying I would fight them. I'm not a violent person, but I don't think my words would be kind.
Got it. Thank you for your call. One more time on this, President Eisgruber.
Yeah, so thank you for the question and for your observations. Let me be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not saying that speech always has to be civil or it's the only kind of speech that we should respect. And indeed, in the book, I make a case for protest, and I talk about why it's important for colleges to accommodate protest on their campus. As I've said earlier, I think we have to draw lines about how those protests can take place so that everybody is able to speak and be heard and do what they need to do on a college campus. But there is an important role in the First Amendment, as well as I think the best kinds of college rules make allowance for this. There is a role for speech that can be uncivil. I also agree with your observation that speaking civilly in lots of different contexts can be hard. And I think one of the things people don't understand about free speech is that it is often hard. People talk about it as though it's an easy thing. It's often a difficult thing. But your own call illustrates, I think, how it is that one can speak civilly about really difficult topics. Your argument and presentation to what was a large radio audience was entirely civil. And I think to the extent that we can do that we can take strong stands on behalf of critical constitutional values, including equality, for the wide variety of people in our communities. If we can do that civilly, we will be more effective in having the kinds of discourse that will drive this country toward justice and the kinds of outcomes that we want.
Before we run out of time, let me ask you about one more thing regarding you that was in the news. The Atlantic, among others, wrote up an exchange you had at a forum with some other university presidents about Trump's critiques of universities in general, Ivy's in particular. The article in The Atlantic included this. Those other university officials, led by Washington University's Andrew Martin and Vanderbilt's Daniel Diermeyer, the chancellors who sparred with Eisgruber on the panel, make up what they call the reformist camp. They accept some of Trump's complaints and believe that the best path forward for higher education is to publicly commit to a kind of voluntary, modified de-wokeification. They argue that some campuses, and this uses Cambridge and Morningside Heights, meaning Columbia and Harvard, and departments like humanities have leaned too far into leftist ideology and allowed anti-Semitism to fester under the guise of protesting Israeli policies. They want the American public to know that they are different from the Ivies, and they think that higher education needs new representation if it's going to regain the country's trust. So what's your take today on that difference, at least as described in The Atlantic?
Well, look, I can't comment on the specifics of an off-the-record meeting, which that was. But let me say this. First of all, university presidents, and I would include my friends at Vanderbilt and Washington University in this description, agree about far more than they disagree about in this regard. And I would note two particular things there. We agree, I think, about the importance of academic freedom. We agree about the importance of this pact between the federal government and our research universities that I described earlier. We agree, too, that where there are things we can do better, we ought to change and get better, and we ought to reform. And then I think there are healthy differences of opinion, as there should be, about exactly how well it is that we are doing and where those reforms need to take place and how to characterize the reforms. A point that I've made before publicly and will reiterate now is I actually think that the universities we have in the United States today are the strongest universities we've ever had and some of the strongest that the world has ever seen. I think on issues like diversity, we have become stronger institutions by virtue of our greater diversity and our greater inclusivity. These universities are better because they attract talent from all sectors of society in a way that they did not do in the past, and that has made them even better than the very strong institutions that used to exist. So, there are there are fine points of disagreement, but also I would say very strong points of agreement about the strength of these institutions and the need to proceed forward.
We have about a minute left. I wonder if I could get one thought from you on one of your previous books. I mentioned in the intro that we might be able to get to a point or two from some of your books from the past that I haven't read. And the one that I'm interested in is the one about the Constitution and religious liberty, in which I've read that you argue that religion gets treated as both too privileged and too punished by modern applications of the so-called wall of separation doctrine. Can you give us a very quick primer on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, the basic point, which I made with my co-author, Larry Sager from the University of Texas Law School, is that we think that the Constitution's commitment to religious freedom is best understood as a kind of equality commitment, that people should be treated neither better nor worse by virtue of their deep spirit, the foundations of their spiritual or moral commitments. And that applies to secular commitments as well as to religious ones. So it is a kind of a broad and powerful sort of anti-discrimination and equality principle. Our complaint about Supreme Court jurisprudence, and I'm afraid we haven't managed to persuade the current court about this, is that religion is too often treated as something different from that, either a ground for privileging people and treating them better, or at times as something that's particularly dangerous. We think that the real constitutional concern there should be about the idea that people are treated less well or better. Either one of those things is a problem because of their foundations of their religious beliefs.
There's some activism in religious liberty circles that churches should be different from other nonprofits in that they should be able to make candidate endorsements in political races. Have you seen that and have a reaction to it?
Yeah, our view would be that churches and other nonprofits, and particularly kind of associations brought together for spiritual, moral, or intellectual purposes, ought to be treated on the same ground. You know, I don't know the details, so there may be some argument that's being made here about why equality would require the difference. But I think that's the right question, and my take would be skeptical about that proposal.
Yeah, there actually is reporting that the IRS has taken the position that churches can now endorse political candidates. I'm sure that's a fight that's just beginning.
Not something I would want for universities.
The president of Princeton University, Christopher Eisgruber, he has a new book called Terms of Respect, How Colleges Get Free Speech Right. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us and our listeners.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Much more to come. The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Now we continue our ongoing coverage of public health with a very consequential guest who's here to take us behind the scenes of the COVID vaccine rollout. We're going to go back to that, as well as to talk about some current issues. But he's definitely going to reflect on some of the lessons learned from that pandemic before another one begins, and given all the changing vaccine politics right now. It's Dr. Seth Berkley, an infectious disease epidemiologist. He's an adjunct professor and senior advisor to the Pandemic Center at Brown University, the former CEO of Gavi, that's the Vaccine Alliance, co-founded COVAX, which was dedicated to vaccine equity around COVID in particular, founded and served as CEO of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. We'll ask about that. There is no AIDS vaccine yet. And he's got a new book called Fair Doses, an insider story of the pandemic and global fight for vaccine equity. So yes, we will talk about the changing vaccine politics and the health implications for sure, but more than that in this segment. Dr. Berkley, welcome to WNYC.
It's great to be with you, Brian.
So your book begins in January 2020. You were at Davos at the World Economic Forum, surrounded by world leaders, including President Trump, who I gather you report dismissed pandemic concerns at the time, but a lot of people did. It was just January. What do you remember from that moment?
Well, the interesting thing, of course, we didn't really know this was going to be a pandemic. We had heard about the cases in Wuhan, and we thought those were coming from this wet market. It could have been, just an exposure, a point exposure. But there began to be rumors of what looked like person-to-person transmission, and, of course, that gets us nervous. So the conversation there was, is this, the big one, or is this a dress rehearsal for the big one? And, of course, given what we know can happen, we decided that we would begin to plan as if this was the big one and get ready for it.
And in a matter of weeks, as we know, COVID-19 had circulated around the world. For listeners who don't know, you led Gavi, G-A-V-I, which is essentially the bulk purchasing system that makes vaccines affordable for poor countries and vaccinates about half the world's children. Then during COVID, you created COVAX, which tried to do the same thing on an emergency timeline for that particular spread of disease. In hindsight, was that realistic, or what kind of a report card do you give it now?
Well, it's an interesting question because what we knew, if you go back to the previous pandemic of avian flu, we knew that a vaccine was made, but that vaccine was bought up by high-income countries, and virtually no vaccine got to developing countries until after the pandemic, when people were finished in high-income countries and some vaccine was donated. And so that's what we were trying to prevent. We knew, of course, that there would not be perfect equity, but at the end, this was the fastest and largest rollout of vaccine in history. And we ended up with developing countries, the 92 poorest countries, which is more than half of the world's population, having a primary vaccination of about 57%, which was compared to 67% globally. So not exactly equitable, but obviously better than we've ever done before. But of course, lots of problems, a slower rollout there, lots of export bans, vaccine diplomacy, et cetera.
Can you talk about vaccine hoarding? You saw wealthy countries like the United States and the UK ordering more doses than their population needed. How did you address this discrepancy while other countries were going without?
Well, first of all, we have to remember at that time we weren't sure that a vaccine could be made. And second, if it could be made, we didn't know which vaccine would work. So it is a completely rational thing if you have money to go ahead and buy not one type of vaccine, but buy 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. And that's what the wealthiest countries did, is bought lots of doses of all different types of vaccine. And of course, what that does is tie up the supply for the rest of the world. So we started out wanting to buy vaccines for developing countries because we think that's the right way to move forward. Of course, we had no money, we had no people, so we had to build everything, which made us slower in terms of being able to move forward. But the critical thing was, as soon as those vaccines that countries had bought began to move towards expiration, then countries were like, wow, we don't want these to expire. We bought all these vaccines. Let's just give them away. And it turned out to not be so simple. We didn't have a donation mechanism. There were liability issues. If a country had bought them and sat under their liability system, it had to be transferred to us and our liability system, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some of the important lessons were there. At the end, we were able to take about 50% of the vaccines we delivered. We delivered 2 billion doses of vaccines to 146 countries, and about 50% of those were ultimately donated doses, which was, of course, good because they didn't get wasted.
Listeners might be thinking on this vaccine hoarding question, some listeners, that it's only fair that countries that contribute more financially to the vaccine development process get first dibs. And I guess in a way it comes down to the old foreign aid debate. Can you make the case for why a New Yorker listening in should feel responsible for vaccination rates in, Sierra Leone, for example?
Absolutely, and it's a very important, point. So, there is obviously humanitarian, philosophy here. But when we think about a pandemic, what we're trying to do is stop transmission as best as possible. And that not only protects other countries, but it also protects, your own country, whatever that is, in this case, the U.S. And so what we would like to see in a pandemic is, of course, the first thing that a leader is going to do is vaccinate their own people. That's what they're there for. That's what they should do. But once they cover the highest risk populations, which in this case were healthcare workers, the elderly, people with comorbidities, then they should vaccinate those people in other countries, because at the end, what you're trying to do is stop that spread. And, it's estimated that about 1 million people died unnecessarily because of vaccine hoarding. And so that's the message we were trying to get out is let's try to operate this as efficiently as possible, protecting each individual country, but also making sure that we deal particularly with healthcare workers in other countries, because if they die and, there's not as many healthcare workers in poor countries per population, then we're really going to have a problem, which of course we did in terms of the global spread.
I'm curious with the global involvement that you had with COVID vaccines, if you saw different rates of vaccine skepticism in different countries, and if that affected ultimately vaccine uptake rates and disease rates.
Yeah, it's a great question, Brian. Vaccine skepticism has existed since the first vaccine, which was the smallpox vaccine. There were wood carvings that showed people having cow's horns growing out of their head after they got the vaccine. So this is a longstanding problem. But it's
let's tell our listeners that that's an interesting part of your book, that you trace the history of vaccine hesitancy back to the 1850s, right?
Yes, that's correct. And the issue here is that we used to be able to deal with vaccine hesitancy. How we worked with community leaders, thought leaders, experts. So, whether it's the village chief or whether it's the doctor or nurse or it's the, community leaders, that's how you dealt with it. It was pretty, not easy, but it was doable. What's changed now, of course, is really a couple of things. One is we have social media, which, of course, moves literally at the speed of light. And so you've got this not only misinformation, but disinformation. The difference there is misinformation is what your aunt might tell you because she's ill-informed but doesn't mean any harm, and disinformation is intentionally giving the wrong information. And we had Russian bots and North Korean bots and Chinese bots, and by the way, the U.S. government providing misinformation during this period as well. But then the other big thing that happened was we had this incredible partisan behavior, and that was tragic. More Republicans per capita died than Democrats did because they didn't get vaccinated. And of course, we're fighting a virus. There should be no politics here. We should be trying to give people the best advice. So to your answer, we ended up with lots of disinformation, and it made countries reject vaccines that they had already asked for, and this really was a tragedy. So and we're still feeling this today because the disinformation is continuing. It's been used to really work on trying to destabilize democracies by providing positive information and negative information at the same time. So this is a real ongoing problem.
But was it different in the United States because we have such an individualistic culture, right? The last 250 years. And so there was all this adamance in certain corners that I'm not going to let the government tell me what to do. The vaccine mandates that were supposed to stop the population spread by requiring something of every individual or most individuals. And I wonder if just the cultures of other countries were different in ways that kind of thing didn't spring up as much.
Well, you're absolutely right. The thing we're living with now is a pushback on mandates in general, not just vaccines, but on, closing schools, on mask wearing, on lots of other issues. Of course, there's a long history of providing mandates. But what's interesting about vaccine hesitancy is that it used to be that the worst vaccine hesitancy was actually in high-income countries. And why is that? Because we don't see these childhood diseases anymore. You talk to an average physician, they've never seen diphtheria, measles, tetanus, because vaccines work so well. Whereas if you're in developing countries, of course, auntie down the road has had a child that died. You see people who are disabled because of these diseases. And so people, understood and wanted to protect their families from it. During the pandemic, people pushed back on these mandates, but the purpose of mandates, of course, course, is to try to protect the whole population. We ended up not having herd immunity. Herd immunity is the concept that if you vaccinate a whole herd of people, or in animals in the case of veterinarian, even if one animal doesn't get a take or get vaccinated, they're protected because everybody else is protected and it can't be transmitted. We couldn't do that with COVID because of the variations, but the original idea was to try to get that coverage up to protect everybody, including those who couldn't get vaccines.
RFK Jr. feels like the elephant in the room here. What are your biggest concerns about his leadership at Health and Human Services if another pandemic were to take root during his tenure, specifically with respect to vaccines, if one could be developed?
Well, first of all, we've disbanded a lot of the systems that are in place to deal with pandemics, so I'm obviously worried about that. But if I had to list my biggest worry, in a pandemic, you start off knowing nothing. And so what do you want to do? You want to turn to experts to give the best sense from what we know about other viruses at that moment in time. And then you want science to go forward, and you want to make sure we have truth. Now, during the pandemic, people would ask questions, where did 6 feet come from? Why is it not 5'11", or 6 foot 1 inch, in terms of numbers? And the answer is, 6 feet was an expert opinion on what might be a reasonable, safe distance. And what you want over time is that to get better. And science doesn't change, but the information that comes from science. So my worry now is we've put in place advisory mechanisms that have known anti-vaccine people on it. We're not following science anymore. And without science, we are just lost. I mean, there's some discussion now of breaking MMR vaccine into 3 separate vaccines. There's no science for that. I mean, of course, at the beginning, they were 3 separate vaccines. That meant 6 shots for kids, and now it's down to 2 shots for kids because they're combined. Doing those types of things create uncertainty in parents and worry, and are not based on science. And that is really the worry. The same thing with attacking mRNA products, and frankly, pulling the funding for Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which is the distribution system for most of the world, which ultimately protects U.S. populations because it stops the spread of these diseases around the world.
On the history of the pandemic, or a point from the history of the pandemic, listener writes, can Dr. Berkley say why Gavi, which he led, decided to put all its eggs into the Indian vaccine manufacturer? As a result of the export ban in India, vaccines never made it to Africa when they were needed. Is that accurate?
Not quite. It's a great question, though. So the nuanced answer for that briefly is the following. We ended up with the largest portfolio of vaccines in the world. We had 11 different vaccines that we had in the portfolio, a range of different types. We started out trying to buy a range of different vaccines. As I said at the beginning, we had no mandate, no money, no staff, but we built that up. We raised $12.5 billion, and we were able to do that. Early on, we technology transferred vaccine to the Indian manufacturer, the Serum Institute of India, which is the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. And they were able to get vaccines out quickly. Of course, what happened was they had the Delta wave in India, severe infections, funeral pyres burning everywhere, and the government, which had access to no other vaccines, stopped exporting it. Now, that did make a big difference in where we are, but we were getting that vaccine from the manufacturer of it, AstraZeneca. We were also beginning to get small doses of mRNA vaccines, and later on the J&J vaccine, some of the Chinese vaccines, a range of different vaccines until eventually Serum came back. In an ideal world, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. We tried not to do that, but of course, mRNA vaccines in the beginning were really only going to high-income countries, and that was something that over time we worked to change.
You do deal in the book with conflicting incentives of vaccine companies in the race against the virus. And, maybe that's part of where, for some people, vaccine hesitancy comes from, or distrust. We hear from the left as well as from the right, and previously more from the left, for many good reasons, don't trust the big pharmaceutical companies. And then we're being told to trust the big pharmaceutical companies.
Well, I think the reason we have governmental agencies is to do a check on what's happening by these companies. That's the role of, say, an FDA and regulatory systems, is to make sure that the products that they are making are safe, that they've been evaluated, and there's continuous monitoring to try to look for side effects or problems or contaminations in them. And so this is it's not a trust, or if it is a trust, it's trust and verify. And I think that's what we want to do.
It's trust in the government agencies that do the verification. I guess some people worry that those agencies have been, too infected by people from the corporations who get appointments in the revolving door.
Well, this is something we hear, but let's be clear. These vaccines have been used in 200 countries around the world. So they've been looked at not just by one regulatory agency, but by literally hundreds of regulatory agencies. And so, we have a pretty good understanding of what's there. So I think skepticism is okay. But again, frank disinformation is the problem, because we're hearing things that just aren't accurate. And that's a problem, because it scares people and it means they won't do the right things. The conversation right now about autism, the idea that circumcision is being talked about, and things like Tylenol and a range of other things, again, without the scientific data behind it, that just confuses people. And that's a real problem.
You're a vaccine specialist, but also with infectious diseases generally. I don't know if this is, on your beat or in your expertise exactly, but the president and his health officials raised concerns about autism risks for babies born after pregnant women take Tylenol, and the state of Texas is suing the manufacturer of Tylenol over those claims, which I keep reading there's no science to support. Do you have anything on this?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. There isn't the science to support it. But even more important, and this is critical for people to understand, is that if women get high fevers in pregnancy, there is an increased risk of autism. So you take Tylenol, it actually reduces the risk of autism from those high fevers. And, of course, autism is a complex disease with many different factors in it. And, by the way, this type of misinformation is the same thing with vaccines. There are side effects for vaccines, but you always have to compare what are the side effects of the natural disease versus that of the vaccine.
Risk versus risk. Do you think it could be a good thing that this lawsuit is filed, and maybe the science will be played out in a courtroom and it will be a slam dunk, and then, all the world will see it? I don't know if they have cameras in the courtroom at whatever jurisdiction this would be heard in, but could it be a good thing?
Well, personally, I prefer to not have things decided in courtrooms in that type of adversarial environment. I much prefer to have a proper scientific discussion with transparency of that data and the ability for people to understand it and understand where the advice comes from and feel comfortable with it. If at the end of the day we're in a situation where we don't have that from the federal government, and you're seeing now people spring up with, state review professional societies like the Pediatric Society or the Infectious Disease Society of America beginning to have recommendations, then so be it. Maybe it needs to happen that way, but that's not a good way, because if we're litigating half every single piece of disinformation, it takes a long time, and that misinformation and disinformation spreads.
Asante in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Asante.
Hey, Brian, spoke to you before. I had a comment and a question, just for background. My sister's an epidemiologist, infectious disease expert, and I lost family members during the pandemic, and it made me very irritated. And I remember asking her, I don't understand how the communication doesn't put across that the science doesn't change like your guest said, but what we know about it may change. And I asked her a historical example. Gregor Mendel is the father of genetics. During his lifetime, he didn't get any credit for all his work on peas. And I remember asking her, why can't we tell people to look in their freezer at peas and understand that all we know about genetics and our cousins and our, hereditary is through Gregor Mendel. And it was devastating for me personally that all my family members, or quite a few of them, they were so skeptical. That's it.
Thank you, Asante. Thank you for telling that story. What are you thinking listening to him, Doctor?
Well, I mean, first of all, Gregor Mendel was very important at the beginning, but the science since then has been exquisite, and we really understand not only how the genetics mixes, but we actually can get right down to the DNA and what's happening, and this is why we're in the midst of this amazing renaissance in science that will ultimately create vaccines for tumor antigens and be able to treat chronic diseases and treat cancers, and so I think the point is science moves forward and people have to, understand it as much as they can and believe in it. The other thing I'd say is that, COVID is still with us. And it is still killing people. And, there was a recent study that just came out by the VA looking at vaccine effectiveness from September to December of 2024, 160,000 people. And they showed a 64% protection against deaths, 39% against hospitalization, 29% against emergency room visits. And so, all of the negative conversations about vaccines hide the fact that it's still a disease that's important and still should be treated as such.
I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, I think the last stats I saw, tell me if this is accurate if you know, COVID in the last couple of years, which we consider post-pandemic generally, in casual conversation, COVID is still in the top 10 causes of death in the United States. Is that true?
That is correct. And obviously infectious diseases continue to be there. And so we've seen not only at the federal level now, but we're seeing there are 350 anti-vaccine bills that have now popped up at state level. 26 have been enacted in 11 states. I mean, so we have to worry about all of this negative information because if you go back in history, basically about 350 out of 1,000 kids died. And that was from infectious disease. And we've dealt with it with vaccines, with sanitation, with better housing, et cetera. But if we don't clean water, if we don't continue to use these tools, we can go backwards and start seeing, polio and measles, which of course is now in the worst spread since it was eliminated in 2000. And that's an example where if it's spreading in the developing world, it can come back here and kill our children.
We have 1 minute left, and I have to ask you, since you used to be CEO of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, if we were able to develop a COVID vaccine at warp speed, as they called it, why, after all these decades, haven't people been able to develop an AIDS vaccine?
Well, the challenge with AIDS is that you get infected with one single virus or a couple of viruses. That's it. But those viruses make so many mistakes because it's a retrovirus that you end up with billions of different strains. So in essence, the strains keep changing as your immune system fights it until it exhausts the immune system. And so that's what's happened. But there have been advances that can make vaccines that conceivably could protect against all strains. Unfortunately, the slashing of research at USAID and at NIH and others have dramatically reduced that research, which had been going on slowly over time. And I feel terrible about that because it's something I invested a lot of my life in. I do believe in the power of science. I think eventually there will be a vaccine. As you know, there are now long-range treatments you can take to prevent the disease. It's not the same as a vaccine, and I hope we get there. I hope those get reinstated for this important disease. And by the way, we're going to see HIV spreading much worse given the cuts that have occurred.
Dr. Seth Berkley, now at Brown, is now author of the book, Fair Doses, an Insider Story of the Pandemic and the Global Fight for Vaccine Equity. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
More to come on The Brian Lehrer Show. Stay with us. It's the Best of Brian Lehrer Show on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We're going to end the show today on nostalgia for the time before cell phones. Are you nostalgic if you lived in the time before cell phones for that time? And the other piece of this is some reporting that we'll refer to, and we'll have the writer as a guest, that Gen Z people who grew up entirely with phones in their lives, obviously, or at least available to them, are also increasingly nostalgic for a time that they never knew before cell phones, let's say pre-2000. I'll tell you one little drill I did with an audience a few years ago when I was doing a public appearance. I asked, how many of you think that the ubiquity of cell phones has made our society worse? And everybody's hand went up. And I said, how many of you are willing to give up your cell phones? Do you think your life would be better today if you just give up your phone? And nobody's hand went up. So that's the dilemma, right, that a lot of people are dealing with. In theory, there's nostalgia for the pre-times. In practice, there's maybe enough convenience, enough interest, enough whatever that people are getting from the phones that they don't want to give up their individual one. So to start, we're joined for a few minutes by the person who wrote the op-ed in the New York Times that spurred this segment. It's Clay Rutledge, social psychologist and author of Past Forward, How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. Hi, Clay. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me.
What were you getting at?
Well, one of the things I think that's interesting is I've been doing this research on nostalgia for over 2 decades now, and most of that work was really focused on our own personal memories and cherished experiences from our lives, but then it started to discover through various projects that people actually express a lot of sentimental feelings towards a time that predates them. And then, of course, we did some research and we found Gen Z in particular seems to be especially nostalgic for a pre-digital era. And so that really captivated me. And I think it really showcases what you illustrated in your previous anecdote, which is it's not that just like people don't want to give up their cell phones, but they recognize some frustrations with the way cell phones have changed our society. Nostalgia isn't really people saying, I want to go back in time. I want to live the way we lived in the past. What they're saying is there's something about the past that I would like to pull forward and incorporate or integrate into my life in a way that helps me balance innovation, technological progress, societal advancement with some things from the past that maybe are useful to hold on to.
So based on your reporting, are people in any number from Gen Z acting on this in any way? Do they even have the power, given everybody's dependence on technology, to go analog or acting on it in any way?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of really interesting trends on this, and that was part of what sparked the survey. Before we started asking people about their historical nostalgia, I was reading these articles of like, oh, Gen Z's driving a lot of the vinyl collection purchases. So a lot of young people are buying records. Gen Z is actually one of the bigger drivers of purchases of physical books. I was just at a concert a couple weeks ago, and it was a bunch of young bands, local bands. And I went out to the merchandise table to just see what they had, T-shirts, CDs, things like that. And I was surprised that one of the bands, which was, a bunch of, Gen Zers, you could only buy their music on cassette tape. Like they were exclusively selling cassette tapes. I had to get on Amazon, and I study nostalgia all the time. I had to get on Amazon to see that you could even buy a cassette player. I was like, how do you even listen to this music? And so, yeah, and again, this isn't in any way overwhelming other trends of digital consumption. Those are prominent, of course. But what we are seeing is all these threads of young people saying, hey, you know what? Instead of just playing video games, we should go buy board games. And if you go to board game stores or game stores or comic book stores and things like that, you will see a lot of them are thriving with board game nights and with trivia nights and with different, young people coming out and saying, I want to get back in touch with real life. As much as I enjoy technology, there's something about the analog, there's something about the in-person, there's something about like real life that maybe we're missing that we could use a little bit more of.
Clay Rutledge, thanks for your thought-provoking op-ed in the Times, and thanks for joining us about it for a few minutes.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And now let's hear from our callers. Ryan in Rockland County, you're on WNYC. Hey, Ryan.
Hi. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Really, happy to share my thoughts here because. So I'm a 25-year-old. I would say I'm very attached, if not, addicted to my phone. And something that I wish for is kind of a bit more of a separation between, what phones are intended to be used for, which is, communication, and, very addictive social media apps. While I am very grateful for the recent technological advances, I can FaceTime my grandmother while she's on a trip to Israel, in 2 seconds. On the other hand, there have been countless nights where I've spent, the wee hours of the morning just scrolling my night away. And, I am nostalgic to back when in fourth, fifth grade, I received my first phone ever. It was a sliding phone, an Intensity 2. And, there wasn't really no social media at that time. And I think there was a bit more of a separation between the, activities we did online and what we used our phone for. And I unfortunately, the way these social media companies make their profits is by keeping people on the platform. But I have thought about on numerous occasions, downgrading to a phone, without internet connection.
And Ryan, I'm going to leave it there. I really appreciate all your thoughts. In our limited time, I want to get some other people on here. Here's a text. Yes. Gen X here, so nostalgic for a world without group chats, the ability to get lost and disconnect without literally leaving the grid, and everyone being able to do that. Madison and Kearney, you're on WNYC. Hey, Madison.
Hi, Brian. So I'm 29. I'm kind of on the cusp between the regular cell phone and the smartphone era. And I remember when, we used to only be able to have a limited amount of texts per day and, wait until after a certain time of day when it was maybe a little more easy to text. And there was something about the mindfulness of how we were communicating and what we were communicating that I think could be really useful today, where we're, having to think about, is do I really need to text this person right now? And do I really want to use all of these characters and say it in this way? I think a lot of times people are kind of communicating without thought, or not really taking the time to pause and say, hey, is this really what I want to say or how I want to say it? And I think that would be, that's something that I'm have been thinking about lately and maybe a bit nostalgic for.
Madison, thank you very much. Here's a text from a listener who writes, I am nostalgic for a time when we weren't on call or available 24/7, 365. We weren't beholden to the phones, didn't waste all day with social media, and if someone called in the middle of the night, it was a real emergency. Then they add, one of the things that I would miss about them, though, is GPS. I would say to that listener, don't forget, you don't have to be beholden to your phone. You can turn your ringer off when you go to sleep and your text message sounder and everything else. And remember, the phone still works for you, and you don't work for the phone or the people who are trying to get in touch with you. All right, let's get one more in here. We heard from two callers in their 20s. So let's hear from one older caller. How about Colleen in Tewksbury? You're on WNYC. Hi, Colleen. We got about 30 seconds for you.
Hey, I'm going way back. So nostalgic may not be the word, but I do miss the fact that way back with regular phones, before caller ID, et cetera, we made prank phone calls. And I can't tell you the hours and hours of great fun we had after school. It was good, clean fun, sitting around, dialing the phone, seeing how long we could keep someone engaged on the phone. And we just belly laughed. And it was,
that's hilarious.
It was really fun. And
but that has
the distance of time.
Hasn't that advanced into the world of deep fakes?
No, that's a whole ball of wax. I'm leaving that one in your court.
Colleen, thank you very much. And thank you, listeners, for your calls and texts. And again, to Clay for the op-ed and talking about it for a minute. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Here's a question for you, listeners. Have you been feeling stuck recently? Specifically, would you like to move, but you can't? Maybe you're in a job you don't love and you want to move to take one in another city, but the housing market is blocking you. Or maybe your family outgrew your apartment 1 or 2 kids ago. Yeah, you know who you are. And are you supposed to be an empty nester, but your recent college grad hasn't found an affordable place of their own to live? Well, you are far from alone. Listen to this headline from the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to talk to their reporter. Nobody's buying homes, nobody's switching jobs, and America's mobility is stalling. With me now is one of the reporters of that article, Rachel Louise Ensign. Rachel, welcome to WNYC.
Thanks so much for having me.
Give us more on your headline. What do you mean when you write America's mobility is stalling beyond what I already said?
Well, a lot of data shows that people are moving to new homes and new cities at around the lowest rate on record. And on the hiring front, you see something pretty similar where companies aren't laying that many people off, but they're also not really hiring either. So a lot of workers are aware of that, and they're just kind of clinging to the job that they have because they are worried about finding a new one if they left.
Let's take an example from your article, a young adult example, a recent college grad, Josue Leon. What's he going through, and what does his story say about his cohort's experience with the American economy right now?
So this young man is a recent graduate from the University of Pennsylvania. He got an engineering degree, so that's something that, should be extremely marketable. And he applied for over 200 jobs and did not get a lot of responses. He did eventually get one offer. This is a young man who, after graduation, was living in Texas, but the offer was in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is just so expensive. Housing costs are so high that he didn't feel like he could take that entry-level job and afford to move there, to get set up in a home. So he kept looking. Eventually, he did find something locally, but it took a really long time for this young man who you would think would be extremely marketable to find something. And he really felt like he could only stay somewhere that had a somewhat lower cost of living because of how expensive certain parts of this country are now.
And where does that story fit into the history of America? Because that's your larger context here, that something that was very American has changed, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, mobility is a uniquely American thing, and a lot of economists think that mobility is it's intertwined with the economic dynamism of our country. There's a big economic boom somewhere, and Americans will pick up and move for jobs. And that's good for the companies looking for workers. That's good for workers. They make more money in this new place that they move. And so this really big decline in all sorts of mobility is something that's really concerning, just given that this has been such a hallmark of our country for decades and decades.
Let's take another kind of example. You talked to two families for your article in the Wall Street Journal who have outgrown their homes as they have had kids. Tell us one of those stories.
Yeah, so there is a family in this story, and this is so there's this big overarching number on share of Americans who are moving, and that number is around a record low. It's really declined a lot recently, and you can see within it what's driving that. And because they ask you, if you do move, why are you moving? And the main reason why fewer people are moving is because of it's clearly because housing is so expensive now. So there's so many Americans who have 3% mortgages, or maybe even below 3%, and even though they would like to move, maybe they have some more kids, their home is feeling a little tight, or even older people, they want to downsize. Financially, it just doesn't work because you would have to give up your 3% mortgage, pay. I mean, homes are a lot more expensive now. So not only a higher mortgage rate, but the price of the home is higher. And it just doesn't make sense. So folks are sticking with what they have. And, you also have people in New York in particular, maybe they have a rent stabilized home and apartment, and they can't leave it because it's $2,000 and the comparable apartment is on the market for $7,000. So pretty much housing costs have gone up so much that people are just hanging on to whatever reasonable housing situation that they have.
Yeah. I used to live next door in a Manhattan building to a family that had, a rent-stabilized apartment, and it was one bedroom, and they raised 3 kids in that one-bedroom apartment. And, both parents worked, but they were of modest means, and they kept their one-bedroom apartment through the entire childhoods of their 3 kids. And that's, of course, the unaffordability of New York in general, but it's also the kind of situation that you were referring to, either from having rent stabilization or from having a low mortgage rate when if you need to sell and buy, mortgage rates are much higher these days, what you call golden handcuffs. That's the phrase, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, on one hand, owning a property and having a great mortgage rate is a good thing to have, but at the same time, there's a level of dissatisfaction that you have with this home that is cheap, but it's not exactly where you would like to be living now. And similarly, there's all sorts of a lot of white collar jobs gave people great salaries, great stock perks and benefits after the pandemic, but a lot of people feel like they really can't leave those right now because there's nothing comparable on offer.
Here's a text from a listener who has another category to raise. Listener writes, overhoused retired people, says retired couples, but it could be individuals as well. Overhoused, that's an interesting word. Retired couples do not sell because of the high capital gains taxes. You aware of this at the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah, we did a whole story about it last year, actually, about how boomers actually own more of the homes that have 3+ bedrooms in this country than millennials with children. And that is definitely a factor. We heard from a lot of readers afterwards that that's part of why they don't want to sell. There are a number of reasons why boomers are sticking around in the big homes that they raise their kids in, but that is certainly one of them, that a lot of them would have to pay a big capital gains tax if they sell.
And for families with kids, I think a particularly New York City angle, but you tell me if this is also a national angle, is that there are very few families in New York City, from what I've read, who have 3 children.
Right.
And of course, there's, the general trend in the country to not have 3 children, to have 1 or 2 more commonly. But those who do want to have 3, they're not staying in the city, even if they started out in the city with their first or second child, right?
Yeah, the Times actually did a story a few days ago on what it takes to have 3 kids in New York City. And as I have little kids myself, and it's very, very expensive on whether it's childcare up until you can get into that 3K pre-K situation, or housing too. The cost of a 3-bedroom apartment in New York City, whether it's to rent or to buy, is extraordinarily high. So I think to do that comfortably, you really do have to earn a lot. And, there are a good number of New Yorkers who do, but it's definitely not the majority of people.
Here's a New York City resident, Scott in Long Island City, Queens. You're on WNYC. Hi, Scott.
Hey, Brian, how are you? Big fan.
Thank you.
Question. The one thing I notice every year is that property tax never stops rising. And the city gets most of its money from property tax. So, once property taxes go up, the landlords just pass them on to everybody else. So is there a solution in the works to stop the tax increase, which then gets passed on to everybody else in the city? And also, as far as rent-stabilized apartments go, there's like 50,000 of them that are offline because the state legislature passed laws to make it impossible for apartments that need renovations to be, brought back online because they're still frozen at $900 rents when tenants finally leave those units after 30 years. So this sounds more like a state problem overall. And like the politicians talk about affordability, but like they're the ones that are causing the problem. So, I'd like to get the thoughts on that. Thank you.
Scott, thank you very much. So he's got that particular New York angle, but I think he also implies a national question with property taxes. Certainly we talk about it so much in New Jersey. New York has its different property tax debate going on right now. But where does this come in nationally, according to your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I am not an expert on New York State property taxes or, how the stabilization law changes have affected affordability and all of that. But one thing I could point to, which is something we talked about in this story, is that, there are a lot of economists who think the shortage of housing and different regulations that make housing hard to build has really weighed on mobility. So, I spoke to an economist in this piece who found that expensive housing dissuaded so many people from moving for better jobs that it actually weighed on the national GDP. So, there are a lot of people who think the evidence is pretty clear that not having, not like basically a housing shortage is a huge part of this lack of mobility, and that it's so significant. It's weighing on the national economy.
Here's one more text from a listener with a New York experience. We keep having to move out of houses we have loved due to gentrification in our hoods. Williamsburg, Upper Bed-Stuy, now Lower Bed-Stuy, where rent has tripled but our income hasn't changed. Meanwhile, I've had 2 kids and my housing is shrinking, but the cost and my kids are growing. But there's no way we could move. We are maxed out. Rents are more money than we make. But give us, as we run out of time, the national implications as you see it, as your sources for this article have described it or warned. You wrote, economists worry the phenomenon of the lowest number of people moving to new homes and new cities is putting some of the country's trademark dynamism at risk. What does that mean? And then we're out of time.
Yeah, well, I think what that means is that it's good for the economy for people to move to new homes and new cities. Economists seem to really agree on that. It's good for a company setting up shop in a city to be able to attract workers from across the country, and it's good for workers to be able to move for a better job. It's good for people like the listener who texted you to be able to find a new home that suits their family. And the fact that is stalling has all sorts of ramifications, including just for how people feel. Consumer sentiment's low. People feel like everything's really expensive and it's only going to get more expensive. And so even though by a lot of measures the economy is chugging along, this stuckness is a factor that really seeps into everything.
Rachel Louise Ensign, economics reporter for the Wall Street Journal, who wrote this very bracing piece on the decline of mobility, one of the signature aspects of life in America, and some things we might do about it. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
More to come on The Brian Lehrer Show. Stay with us. The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. If you're a regular listener to On the Media, you might have caught Season 2 of the miniseries The Harvard Plan. By way of background, in Season 1, they explored the history of how the political right has been at odds and at times trying to dismantle the credibility of institutions of higher education. Made in partnership with the Boston Globe, the series focused on the tenure of Harvard's first black president, Claudine Gay, and how she was pushed out of her position in the wake of the protests against the war in Gaza. This new season explores how the Trump administration is attempting to force Harvard and many other universities to change their policies by freezing billions of dollars in federal research funding, launching several investigations into DEI initiatives that the administration thinks are discriminatory toward white students and threatening international student enrollment. So Ilya Meritz is back as reporter on part 2 of this story, that is season 2, and he joins us now. Some of you will remember that Ilya was co-host of the Trump Inc. podcast during Donald Trump's first term and the Will Be Wild podcast about the events leading up to January 6th. Now he's with the Boston Globe and doing this series for the Globe and OTM on the media. Hey, Ilya, welcome back to WNYC.
Hey, Brian, great to be here.
Remind people of the very basics here. What gave you the idea for the Harvard plan? What were you first setting out to explore in season 1?
Yeah, so I just happened to be a visiting fellow at Harvard in the fall of 2023, which is when Harvard got its first black president, as you said, Claudine Gay. And listeners may remember pretty quickly she stumbled into just a kind of a multi-dimensional miasma of crises. It kind of kicked off with the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel and a Harvard student group's, I think, ill-advised and very intemperate and insensitive response to that attack. And it just sort of spiraled from there to include questions around race and affirmative action and anti-Semitism, of course, and eventually Claudine Gay's own scholarship. So I went to the Globe after finishing that fellowship and made a podcast miniseries sort of about this, because I was interested in the idea that anybody really cared who was the president of a college or university. It's very rare that a university president is somebody whose name is known, much less becomes a focal point for so much attention as Claudine Gay did. That was the first season of the Harvard Plan about a year ago. The second season, the one that I've just brought out, really sort of answers some of the questions that we posed in the first season. What is this all about? Why the sudden focus on higher education? It's not like it's never been a focus before, but it hadn't been a particularly politically salient issue for a long time. And all of a sudden, all this heat on universities. And we see now with Donald Trump being reelected, coming in, fulfilling a lot of his campaign promises. He campaigned on the idea that he was going to take, kind of teach universities a lesson. And very quickly on coming to office, he attempted to do so through a variety of means, including withholding scientific research grants. We have a couple of clips from your season 2 as conversation starters here. I'm going to set up the first one now. On this one, we're going to hear how on the political right there's been a growing chorus of voices that says Harvard and other universities are promoting liberal views while silencing conservative views. So in episode 1 of this second season, you spoke with Kit Parker, a Harvard bioengineering professor who voted for Trump twice. And as you note, when he voted for Trump in 2024, Parker, as a Harvard professor, was hoping Trump would take a look at universities. Listen.
We're unable to complete our mission by hosting debate and thoughtful discussion about the issues of the day represented by both sides. We continue to lower standards for admissions and scholarship and the integrity of scholarship.
Between the ever-expanding bureaucracy and the leftward drift of campus conventional thinking, Kit felt stifled.
We had spent 10 years talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, while we were aggressively excluding or silencing conservative voices on campus. Harvard should be like an intellectual cage match.
Intellectual cage match, that critique coming from a Harvard professor. And Parker isn't talking in the abstract. You report, Ilya, about how his course on policing was canceled in 2021 and how he was investigated by the university. So tell us more about Professor Parker's experience and why you included him in your reporting.
First off, I want to say Kit Parker is a fascinating guy. I went to visit him in his lab on a Saturday morning at 8 a.m. and he'd already been up for several hours, done a workout and taken a meeting. He is in the Army Reserves, and you can kind of hear that, I think, in some of his word choices and his cadence. And he's a professor of bioengineering. Don't ask me exactly what that entails, but it's very complicated. So yeah, Kit Parker is one of these profs who I think in a lot of ways is what you want in a scholar. He has a very restless, engaged mind. He taught a course on fashion when he got sort of interested in the failings of a type of camo that he observed when he was on deployment in Afghanistan. He has a patent for like a smoker, like a barbecue smoker. So he's a very, very interesting guy. And one of the things that he got interested in was how some battlefield techniques used by the U.S. military in Afghanistan were being applied in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is a pretty poor, pretty troubled city in the western part of the state. And, for some time, that course aroused not a lot of interest. There was a favorable profile in 60 Minutes, I think in 2013. And then he was going to be offering the course again, I believe it was in 2020. And the course listing came to the attention of some activists. And what they saw was, or what they believed they saw, I think, was a class that really kind of vouched for the idea of militarized policing, using, military counterinsurgency techniques against Americans in an American city. And they found it very offensive, and they started a petition. And you can remember this was, the summer of George Floyd protests. And it was sort of that sense of like a social media fueled campaign where perhaps the campaigners had a good point, but perhaps they also didn't take the time to learn more about what Kit Parker was teaching. In any case, the class was effectively kind of canceled for a variety of reasons. It did kind of quietly come back a few semesters later. But what really upset Kit Parker, the professor behind the course, is he felt the university didn't speak up for him, didn't speak up for the idea of academic freedom, didn't speak up for the idea of open inquiry, and the idea that, Harvard can offer a class that you may find some of the premises disturbing or offensive, but it's worth examining. Let's have a look. Let's not just blanket kind of cancel things that we think that we don't like. So Kit Parker is, as you mentioned, a Trump voter. There are plenty of professors on the more centrist or liberal end of the spectrum or who just don't have a political leaning particularly, who also feel that there was a kind of a censoriousness that kind of seeped into university life. And so that's definitely a big element that I discovered kind of underpinning, I think, the Trump campaign on universities is also sort of an understanding that many people inside those universities are also unhappy with the way that discourse has gone lately.
So I guess this gets to where is the line now as it pertains to the Trump administration between promoting genuine viewpoint diversity, which is what they say they're for, and actually really trying to go all the way in the other direction and make sure people in academia, people in the news organizations, et cetera, only parrot or emphasize what they believe in, otherwise they're going to be punished. So, for example, I think you have former Harvard President Gay saying that attacks on institutions of higher education are because universities are centers of independent thoughts. And yet you also have this clip, which we're going to play now, of May Mailman, who spent most of the year as a senior policy strategist in the White House. She worked closely with Stephen Miller, I think just under Stephen Miller. And here's a clip of her responding directly to claims of authoritarianism in the way the Trump administration is pushing universities toward compliance with their demands.
What type of authoritarian regime would be like, I want more debate. I want views explored, debated, and challenged. Fundamentally, what is being sought here is freedom and the lack of an orthodoxy rather than an implementation of one.
I love how she travels around with those chimes wherever she... I'm kidding. part of the original soundtrack, by the way, we might say, written for the Harvard Plan, wasn't it?
Yes, that was from our amazing engineer and sound designer, Jared Paul, the music. I felt very fortunate to get to talk with May Mailman. She is really the person, I think, pretty much more than anyone who stood behind this sort of pressure campaign on universities, whether it was drafting executive orders or leading negotiations with universities. She just left the White House to have a baby, and she made time for me right around the time that she was due. We talked for over an hour, and it was really, really fascinating. And I think the clip you played kind of gets to this very interesting question, which is like, is it plausible that the heavy hand of the government could bring about a healthy level of viewpoint diversity that has been lacking and maybe needs to be there on college campuses and at universities? So that's her view would be yes, and the government, not only can it be done, but the government should do it. And there is a proposal circulating. They call it basically the Trump Compact, which would require universities to assess the political leanings of faculty, staff, and students and report on that. So chew on that for a moment. Really, on the other end of that discussion would be somebody like Princeton President Christopher Eisgruber, who finds that totally macabre, thinks it's a gross overstepping of bounds, and would really say, actually, believe it or not, and contra what's being said about universities, colleges and universities are some of the last places where reasonably good, reasonably high level debate does sometimes happen. I feel like the kind of hidden imagined villain kind of like hovering over my whole inquiry was kind of the way that social media has changed discourse in this country, and particularly the way in which it has gotten into the discourse around higher education, where, social media moves fast, it rewards virality, it rewards emotion, and the academy is supposed to be the exact opposite. It's supposed to be the place where everything moves slow, it's deliberate, there's peer review, we don't do mobs. So it's just been an absolutely fascinating subject to delve into.
Here's a question that really goes back to season 1 about Claudine Gay, the former president of Harvard. And I wonder I don't remember if you drilled down on it this deeply, but when she was testifying with the other Ivy League university presidents, and Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik asked her about the killing of African Americans, and the president answered the same way that she went on to answer the Intifada questions. This is how the listener is writing the text, and concludes, it was a setup. Did you drill down to that degree?
No, I didn't, but I do find that moment, that congressional testimony, was really kind of a huge turning point, because that was the moment where kind of, I think, a critical mass of Americans came to the belief that something is very wrong with universities and needs to be done. There have always been people who are unhappy with how things are at universities, and I think there's particularly been a long-running conservative critique of university life going back to William F. Buckley, God and Man at Yale in the 1950s. I think what October 7th and the aftermath and that congressional testimony in 2023, that was December 2023 with Elise Stefanik, what that did was really kind of gel in people's minds the idea that something is seriously wrong here and, is maybe worth the government getting involved to the degree that it now is. I also want to say, part of how I view my job as a journalist is to mark changes. We live in a fast-changing world, sometimes a world where things change so fast that it's kind of dizzying, and it's worth remembering that, not only did we not pay very close attention to who was leading our colleges and universities until very recently, it was also unthinkable that an individual college or university could be singled out by the government in the way that Columbia was, and later Harvard and UVA and several other schools. It was inconceivable that cancer research or Alzheimer's research could be kind of turned into an improvised weapon, basically, to try to bring about changes at these universities. So part of what I'm trying to do with this series is just show how much the standards have changed, how much what is acceptable or imaginable has changed in a very, very short period of time.
And one of the most interesting things to me in season 2 was your focus on Jay Bhattacharya last week, who is the head of NIH now, right? The National Institutes of Health. And you spoke to Ashish Jha, who some listeners may know that name. He's been a guest on this show more than once, really during the pandemic as a public health expert. He's the dean of the public health school at Brown. He was in the Biden administration as a public health official, and he knows Jay Bhattacharya and considers him to be an earnest person who really cares about public health, but he took this job with the Trump administration and has been involved with eliminating so much funding for medical research, which was his field, medical research. And Ashish Jha, to my ear, Ilya, sounded tortured about this. He really wanted to still believe that Jay Bhattacharya is a person of goodwill, but here he is out there not contradicting some of the, let's say, wackiest things that RFK Jr. might say, and cutting funding to his own field, which we could say is crucial to humanity, medical research. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Jay Bhattacharya is a absolutely fascinating figure. He's a double degree haver. He has a medical degree and he also has an economics PhD, and his specialty has been healthcare economics for many, many years. He's highly credentialed. Nevertheless, it's pretty much inconceivable, or would have been inconceivable, that he would have become the director of the National Institutes of Health until very recently. So his qualifications, I would say, are he's highly credentialed and he has the correct politics. And he really kind of came to public attention. He really emerged as a public figure during COVID. He was one of the 3 original signers of the Great Barrington Declaration, which basically called for herd immunity, and following herd immunity to get most people kind of back to work, back at school, back in everyday life, except for the elderly and the immunocompromised.
Meaning largely let the COVID-19 virus spread. It will take the lives that it takes, but it'll get society back to normal more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, their view was that for people who are not immunocompromised or not elderly, we could just basically let the virus spread, and that more harm was being done, particularly with schools being closed or being online.
More selectively shut things down or vaccinate. Go ahead.
Interestingly, people like Ashish Jha would now concede that there was probably some truth to that and that he probably got shut down too hard. But Jay Bhattacharya's radicalization story is that when he started speaking out, he started getting a lot of blowback inside his own university, which was Stanford, from the then leaders of the public health establishment saying that we need like a swift and devastating takedown of this way of thinking. So the other thing that's really fascinating about Jay Bhattacharya, which I delve into in the episode, is he was mentored by Alan Garber, who's the current president of Harvard. And so arguably 2 of the biggest adversaries in this fight are 2 men who have known each other for decades. They have co-authored papers together. They really look at the world in a very similar way. They're both healthcare economists. They're both double MD econ PhDs. And yet one kind of had this radicalization moment where he felt that he was shut down. He wasn't able to kind of express his view. And that's Jay Bhattacharya. And that kind of put him on the path where he is, where he's now, very much kind of in the Trumposphere. And the other is Alan Garber, who followed much more of the kind of established, expected path of, climbing an organizational ladder. He's now the president of Harvard and is in the really unenviable position of trying to deal with having billions of dollars in funds withheld from laboratories and research institutions that Harvard runs.
We continue with Elia Meritz, who reported and produced season 2 of the Harvard Plan about the Trump administration and higher education. And Lainey in Hoboken, you're on WNYC with Elia. Hi, Lainey. Thank you for calling in.
Hi. Thanks for talking about this. I'm so grateful for this conversation. Just real quick, I'm with a bunch of other professors at my university, Stevens Institute of Technology, and there's a huge diversity of political leanings, more so I'd say than on most campuses. Like there's from super lefties to super conservatives and Trumpers. There's such a big diversity in students and faculty that we decided in the wake of all this, we want to actually be very concrete and draft our own definition of academic freedom to put in our handbook, our faculty handbook, and to show our students. And we're having a lot of trouble, and I wonder if you can help us out with any recommendations for how to very liberally define academic freedom for a really diverse bunch of learners and thinkers.
Wow. Ilya, you want to engage on that?
Gosh, I'm not sure if I can quite take that on. What are the stumbling blocks, though? I'm curious.
Well, it is tricky because there are people who are really psyched, I would say, for the reforms going on in the government, and there are people who are really terrified of the pressures on academia. And I come from a big academic family, and I kind of revere the concept of academic freedom. And I've realized when I try to define it, it's really tough for me not to let my liberals, even an old-fashioned world now, progressive lefty values kind of seep into the definition. And we're trying really hard to have as inclusive and broad a definition that can get people who support the present administration in Washington and people who are terrified of it, so that they can both look at this definition and go, yeah, this is what academia is for. This debate that you're talking about, this is, like what we look to Eisgruber and we're like, yeah, Eisgruber is in a sense talking about cherishing academia as a place for genuine debate. But I guess I'm a music professor. I don't know how to write this in an inclusive, really positive way for this broad community.
I'm just curious, have you heard from any of the kind of Rutgers people? And the reason I ask is in our third episode, I talked with Paul Boxer, who's a professor of psychology at Rutgers Newark. And he was one of the drafters of something that was called the Big Ten Compact. It didn't really happen, but it was the idea of a mutual aid compact that Big Ten schools would do. And he told me, that didn't take off for a variety of reasons. And he told me he's now kind of refocusing his efforts on kind of cross-university solidarity in New Jersey and trying to sort of build support for academic freedom, as you say, and political support sort of in the New Jersey legislature to just kind of make it ironclad that at least in New Jersey, universities, particularly public institutions, are not going to be subject to a certain kind of political pressure. I think what you're describing is something that's happening everywhere, where institutions and the professors who work there are like, how can I inoculate this place against the problems that we're seeing cropping up, at Harvard?
Lena, I hope that's somewhat helpful. And I heard you perk up there when he mentioned that it's kind of a New Jersey-wide effort since you're at Stevens. So I hope that's helpful. We're going to go to another New Jersey caller, a community college student in Newton. Joanne, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call. As stated, I am a student at Sussex County Community College. We're a pretty small community college, kind of in the woods, essentially. But I just wanted to mention that it's definitely felt even in the smaller institutions. I know a lot of the talk is about the top 10s and all of these much bigger institutions, but it's definitely felt all the way down to the beginnings where a lot of people are starting their education journey, including myself. There's currently a history professor I have who I admire greatly. He essentially views history in the form of bottom to top rather than a left to right. So being very critical of systems and institutions and giving a lot of people patience and grace, which is something I appreciate a lot. when you view the complexity of U.S. history in general. But there was complaints even from students, I'll say definitely more conservative-leaning students that felt upset by the fact that he would criticize the systems and, not even necessarily criticize it. But there was a lot of complaints, and he was actually brought into an administration meeting in regards to academic freedoms. And it basically came down to the fact that he is allowed to teach how he wants to teach, but they cannot protect him at the end of the day if the board decides to let him go at the end of the school year. And that's something I definitely take issue with, because I personally would not complain about a conservative teacher. I appreciate broad viewpoints, but you can definitely see that there is a trickle-down effect when it comes to institutions even as small as Sussex County Community College.
Really interesting. Ilya, any thought?
Well, May Mailman herself, sort of the quarterback of Trump's pressure campaign on universities, herself conceded that Harvard is not the most liberal university. So you ask yourself, why are Harvard and Columbia and some of these schools a target? And I think it's because they're the most prominent, because if you can get them to submit, then, as the caller says, there is, a kind of a trickle-down effect. I want to say one more thing. I know we're getting kind of close to time, but there's a reason that the United States government has this particular kind of partnership with universities, and it's pretty unusual in the world that our government funds quite so much basic science research. And it's really a reason that we have so many Nobel Prizes in our country, much more than many of our kind of peer countries in the industrialized world. And it's really that at the end of World War II, a man named Vannevar Bush kind of proposed a system, a compact, where the United States would fund the National Science Foundation, NIH, all these other organs, and put that money out into research laboratories and really do it in this very kind of arm's length, non-politicized way, where peer-reviewed proposals that appear to be good are the ones that get greenlit. And in his view, universities should be independent. They should be independent, equal partners of the government. And so what I really learned, if I had one takeaway from doing this series, it's that the Trump approach, which they're trying to pull off, but it's not completed yet, is a very significant revision of that compact. And it says, no, universities are a junior partner to the government, whether they're public institutions, private institutions. If they get this kind of government money, they are subservient partners. It is a contract relationship, and the dominant partner in the contract is the government. And that looks a lot more, whether you think this is actually authoritarian or not, that looks a lot more like what happens in authoritarian countries.
I'll note that Ilya mentioned that he sees the clock and how much time we have, because in his previous life, Ilya Meritz started at WNYC as a Brian Lehrer Show producer behind the scenes, I will say with extreme pride, before he went on to be one of America's leading on-air journalists in the medium of audio. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished, Ilya.
Thanks for getting me started, Brian.
But to finish on the thought you were just making, we have two texts that kind of counterpose each other. One on the right says, sounds like a bunch of snowflake fascists are mad because they can't repress the population anymore with their propaganda. And the other one says, how is it punishment to deny medical research to Harvard? Don't they argue back that Republicans get cancer too? And you asked that question explicitly. Even if anti-Semitism was generally the target, repressing anti-Semitism, how does denying medical research relate to that? Don't Republicans get cancer too?
Yeah, I mean, the administration would say if you're not laser focused on fighting anti-Semitism, how can you also be a great research institution? I found it. I didn't quite follow the connection, and I think a lot of damage will be done along the way to critical research if this goes on for very much longer.
Ilya Meritz, host of the On the Media miniseries called The Harvard Plan. All 3 episodes of season 2
with the Boston
are out
Globe.
now.
With the Boston Globe.
And the Boston Globe. Wherever you get your podcast. Ilya, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's been such a pleasure.
That's the Brian Lehrer Show for today, produced by Mary Croak, Lisa Allison, Amina Cerna, Carl Boisrond, and Esperanza Rosenbaum. Zach Goddard-Cohen edits our National Politics podcast, which is an edit of this show. Megan Ryan is the head of live radio. You have Juliana Fonda and Milton Ruiz at the audio controls most days. Stay tuned for all of it.